A common criticism aimed at these machines is the limited effects. For example, there is only one guitar effect block. Here it is. And you can see 4 separate sub-effects within the block. And although these can be applied in series, they're all part of the block, you can only apply the block to one track at any one time. That's what this number means at the top. This says the block is inserted into track 1. If I select track 2, the block is inserted into track 2 instead. Now there's also only one send effect. And again, it's got several types. But although you can apply this to multiple tracks, it can only be one of these types at any one time. And workarounds for these have already been covered in the tutorials. And one solution is to bounce each track separately with the required effect. But this obviously needs multiple passes, and you can only judge the results at each pass. But it can be done. Now there's one effect whose limitations we've not really covered, the dynamic effects. Now these effects can only be inserted into input paths, so one criticism is that there's no obvious way of applying a dynamic effect after you've recorded a track. Now, a partial workaround, if you just want a compressor or even a noise suppressor, is to use the guitar effect block, as this also contains these 2 effect types. The guitar effect compressor has fewer settings than the dynamic version. You'll see we've got compression, attack and level, whereas the dynamics compressor has extra settings. But with the guitar effect, the compressor and noise suppressor are separate sub-effects within the block, so you can chain them together and use both at the same time. And as we've seen, it's fairly easy to insert the guitar effect block after recording. But again, you're still limited to one track at a time. But there is another workaround which gives you full access to all the dynamic effects. You need some extra equipment. It's one of these. But be warned, this may be a bit heavy going, as it relies on being familiar with the signal paths, which was one of the main aims of these tutorials. So if you're following along, pause the video as needed and try to follow the paths on the block diagram. Now when we looked at bouncing, we saw there was an internal link from the bounce bus, which was a mix of all the selected source tracks and inputs, back to the designated target track for recording the bounce result. Now if we could somehow make a link which goes back further, right to the inputs, we could insert a dynamic effect at that point. So that's what the patch cable is for. We're going to connect a track output back to a spare input and insert a dynamic effect into that input path. We can then assign that input to a new track and record it. So let's say track 1 contains the original recording. And let's say you want to compress it using the compressor from the dynamic effects. Well, first we need to get the track signal out of the machine, independent of the main mix. So how do we do this? Well, as you've seen before, the effect send outputs are ideal for doing just this. They are general purpose outputs which you can use for any purpose, not just send effects. There are 2 of these, so you can use either one, but remember the internal send effect uses the signal on send 1. So if you want to use this at the same time, use send 2 instead. Now I'm not interested in the send effect, so I'll use send 1 for this example. Now one important note, any time you connect outputs to inputs, be very careful to avoid feedback loops. So turn your levels down, and ideally create your new song in a known state, say by using a template as shown in tutorial 2. Okay, let's make the connections. It's a lot easier if you have a patch bay, but if not, power off first. Connect the patch cable from effect send one to a spare input, say input A, and power on. And we want to record this signal, so assign input A to your target, say track 2. Assign, select track 2, source A. This is where the compressed signal will be recorded. Now go to the mixer screen, select the target track, track 2, confirm up here, and confirm send 1 is off. That's this here. If send 1 has been left on, say from a previous song, there's a real risk you'll get feedback later. But if you've used a template, you would not have to check this. Now arm the target track, so track 2 rec. Now select the source track, which is track 1, and turn on its send 1 signals. Again, confirm track 1 is in the mixer, and now we're going to turn on send 1. I'm going to set to pre, so the amount of send is independent of the track fader. Turn that down anyway. And turn up the send level. And don't forget the master 1 level as well. Now go back to the home screen and press play. You should see the original signal on track 1 and the loopback signal ready for recording on track 2. Now set the trim for input A to 1 o'clock. And if you've done it right, the levels will be roughly the same. Now this raises an interesting point, so apologies for a small detour. Now some users have been struggling to hear send effects, and the reason is because they have not turned up the send levels high enough. Now I've always recommended turning them up full to start with, like we have here, as I was fairly sure the controls act as attenuators as opposed to gain controls. So turning them up full just means they are at their unity gain positions. In other words, they are passing the original signal through unchanged, as opposed to amplifying them like say the track fader does when you go above the 0 dB level. You get an extra 6 dBs of boost. Now this loopback configuration allows you to test this theory. We need one more piece of information, which I may have mentioned before, but if not, measurements made during the earlier videos showed that when the trim controls are at roughly their 1 o'clock positions, the preamp section is neither amplifying nor attenuating. In other words, this is the unity gain position for the trim control. This means that in this position, with no effects or EQ in the path, the meter bars will reflect the exact level at the input socket. So now we know this, we can see that with the loopback cable connected, the send and master levels turned up full, and the input trim at unity gain. If the meter bars for tracks 1 and 2 are equal, then this means the send levels are also at unity gain. Okay, well, detour over. The bottom line is, don't be afraid to turn the send levels up full. Right, now we've got track 1 looping back into input A, we can finally insert a dynamic effect into input A's path. So go to the dynamic screen, select source A, confirm at the top, and choose your effect and settings. In this case we want the compressor. If you press play, turn up the stereo fader and the monitor knob, you can use track fader 1 to play back the original uncompressed signal, and track fader 2 is the compressed signal. So you can compare with and without the effect and tweak the settings as required. Let's make this compressor do something more audible. Give it a very high ratio, small attack, small release. There, I think you can hear there's a difference now. That's the original. That's the compressed version. Okay, just a couple of points. Neither fader affects the recording levels, but you knew that. Now, something more subtle though, you cannot use the mute and solo system to compare the two tracks, not at this stage at least. The mute and solo buttons also affect the send signals. And we covered this on earlier videos, but if you mute track 1, it also mutes track 1's send signal. So nothing will get looped back to track 2. Okay, when you're happy with the settings, press rewind and press record. And we're now recording the compressed signal onto track 2. Okay, once the track has been recorded, make sure you turn off the sends to avoid accidents. And the simplest way, as a temporary measure, is to turn down the master send level. Now, you don't need to select any track or input, as the master control applies to all sends regardless, as its name suggests. And now the recording has been made, you can use mute and solo to compare the tracks as normal. The sends are no longer being used. Now, you may have noticed this is very similar to how you would use an external send effect. The send outputs go to your effects box, and the effect outputs return or loop back to the inputs. In this case we are just using a cable instead of a send effect. And note, this is all in normal multi-track mode. There is no need to go into bounce mode. And finally, don't forget each path has its own EQ, so you could apply this at the same time as the effect. Right, there's a small variation on this which I'll leave for you to try. We've only used one send output, so why not do the same trick with a different track looping back to a different input? You just need another patch cable, but it means we could create two new tracks with different or the same dynamic effects or EQ in a single pass. So on the face of it, this external loopback technique sounds more flexible than bouncing, but there are a couple of caveats. The second track was created by passing the first track through the complete machine, out of the digital domain to the analog world and back in again. Now, this has two side effects, if you'll excuse the pun. One is a slight loss in quality, although I would argue this is negligible and can be ignored, on the grounds that if your recording equipment and environment is good enough to hear a difference, why are you using a $400 machine? A bigger problem is the delay or latency through the machine. Here's an oscilloscope picture of the start of a drum beat. The top trace is track 1, the bottom is track 2. Now the difference is 1.3 milliseconds, And this is fairly small, so should not be a problem if you're monitoring your vocals in your headphones, say. But there may be audible phasing artifacts if you try and mix the two tracks together. But don't let me put you off. Try it yourself. It may not be an issue. And just for completeness, I bounced track 1 to track 2, so the signal never leaves the digital domain, and the delay was 40 microseconds, about 30 times less. Okay, this video's got pretty long now, so I'll continue with more workarounds in the next one. See you there.